The first time he asked me who I was, I didn't understand what was going on. I thought it was a joke, one of those silly confusions that comes with age, but there was something in his gaze, something I'd never seen before in my father. It was as if he stood before me, his eyes open, but his soul elsewhere. And when he spoke again, his voice trembling, everything inside me fell silent. He looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Where is my daughter? Why are you in her house? Who let you in here?" That moment froze in time, as if the air had frozen around us. I could barely breathe. I struggled to blink. The clock on the wall still read 6:43 in the afternoon, but inside me everything stopped. His voice, that voice that had lulled me to sleep as a child, now pushed me away, turning me into a stranger. I felt as if I were being ripped from his story, as if I had been erased from his memory with an invisible, cruel rubber band. I tried to speak. I told him, "Dad, it's me, Camilla, your daughter." But he backed away, confused, scared. He asked me to leave, that he'd call the police, that he didn't know what I was doing there. And in that instant, I knew something inside him had died, even though his body was still alive. I felt like a part of me died too with that sentence, because I never imagined that the person who taught me to say my name, one day I wouldn't remember it anymore. Alzheimer's doesn't give warning. It doesn't knock. It enters slowly, silently, and begins to steal the most valuable thing we have, our memories, our history, our identity, and it does so mercilessly. At first, I thought it was just another forgetfulness, like when he lost his keys or called me by my cousin's name. We laughed. I told him he was getting old. He joked, saying he was selective about what he wanted to remember. But that afternoon, when he looked at me without recognizing me, I knew it was no longer a joke. It was the beginning of the end. My hands trembled as I tried to reach out. I wanted to touch his shoulder, hug him, make him come back, but he avoided me. His body tensed. He looked at me as if I were a threat, as if I were standing before a thief or an unknown nurse. And that was what hurt me the most, because I was his daughter, his only daughter, the girl he carried on his shoulders, the one he took to her first day of school, the one who cried in his lap over a broken heart. And now, in his mind, I was nobody. The television was still on, just some random show. The curtains moved in the soft afternoon breeze. Everything was normal, except for him, except for that enormous void that opened between us and that no words could close. I thought about all the memories we had together, about his stories from his youth, about how he loved to dance salsa with Mom in the kitchen, about the made-up stories he told me before bed. And I wondered if all of that, every one of those moments, had already been lost inside him, like leaves blown by the wind, carried to a place from which they would never return. At that moment, I didn't cry. I couldn't. It was as if the pain was so deep that even tears couldn't find their way out. I just sat there, looking at the man who had once been my world, and who now looked at me as if I had never been part of his. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake him. I wanted him to look at me and say, "Camilla, honey, I'm sorry. It was just a moment." But that never came. Only silence. A dense, cruel, eternal silence. There are things you're never prepared to experience. Your father forgetting who you are is one of them. Because it's not just that he forgets your name. It's that he forgets that he loves you. He forgets that he took care of you. He forgets the words he used to comfort you. And then you start to forget too. You forget what it was like to feel safe in his embrace. You forget what his laugh sounded like when he was happy. You forget what his eyes looked like when he spoke of you with pride. And worst of all, you start to wonder if there's still some part of him that still carries you inside. That night, when I got back to my room, I opened the drawer where I keep my old photos. I pulled out one of us at the beach when I was 5 years old. He's crouching down, arms open, and I run toward him with a huge smile. I remember that day like it was yesterday. The smell of the sea, the warmth of the sun, the taste of the ice cream melting in my hand. But now he doesn't remember anything. Not the beach, not the sea, not my laughter. I caressed the photo with my fingers. as if I could feel it again. And I silently promised myself something. No matter how much you forget me, Dad, I will never forget you. Because what you were to me is greater than any illness. Because love doesn't disappear with memory. It stays. It stays in the gestures, in the silences, in the way I tuck you in at night. It stays in my voice when I call you, even if you don't answer. It stays in me, even if you no longer know who I am. What I experienced that day was more than a sad scene. It was an invisible fracture in the soul, an open wound that doesn't heal with time. Because when Alzheimer's enters your home, it doesn't just take the memory of the person who suffers from it. It also tears away pieces of those you love. It robs us of life. It leaves us orphaned of someone who is still breathing. And the scariest thing is that every day could be that day. Every look could be the last. Every smile could be the last. Every word could be the last time your father is your father. That's why, ever since then, every morning when I wake up, I prepare to lose him a little more. And yet, I'm still there. Because love doesn't need to be remembered to continue existing. Because it can forget everything. But I can't. I'll never be able to forget. My name is Camila Hernandez. I am 42 years old. I live in Miami, in a small 2-bedroom apartment with walls filled with memories that are no longer recognizable. I work as a nurse at a community hospital in the north end of the city. I am used to pain. I have seen death many times. I have heard the last breaths of strangers and held the hands of patients who had no one else. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for watching my own father fade away before my eyes while he was still alive. Because losing someone you love slowly, without goodbyes, without warning, is like dying in slow motion every day. My routine with him has become a delicate choreography. Every morning I get up at 6. I make coffee, the same one he's been drinking for decades, strong, with 2 spoonfuls of sugar. I leave the newspaper open on the table for him, although he no longer reads it. I put on his favorite music on an old radio that still plays with dignity. Salsa, boleros, sometimes a little tango. And I talk to him, although he doesn't always respond. I say, "Good morning, Dad. You slept well." Sometimes he smiles at me. Other times, he just looks at me with that blank expression that reminds me that the person he used to be is already far away. On the dining room wall is a picture he hung himself years ago. A photograph of our family taken in 1993 at Christmas. Him, my mother, and me. His arm around my shoulders, his laugh broad and proud. He always liked to brag about me. He said I was his greatest achievement, that no carpentry work I built, no furniture I carved, would ever be as valuable as having raised a good, hard-working daughter. He repeated that to me like a mantra, but now, when we walk past that photo, he says nothing. Sometimes he looks at it curiously, as if observing someone else's life. I wonder if it still seems familiar to him, if some spark is igniting inside, or if it's just another image on an unfamiliar wall. On Sundays, weather permitting, I take him to the park 3 blocks away. I sit him on a bench under the big broadleaf tree, the same one where we used to run when I was a child. He doesn't walk much anymore. His steps are unsteady, short, as if he's afraid the ground might disappear beneath his feet. I carry a blanket, a bottle of water, and sometimes a small pocket radio. Once, while a bolero by Los Panchos was playing, I noticed him slowly moving his fingers to the rhythm of the music. It was an instant, almost imperceptible, but I saw it, and that small gesture filled me with hope for days. Sometimes when I'm having difficult days at the hospital, when a patient slips through my fingers or a family breaks down in tears on my shoulder, I come home wishing I could be the daughter again. Not the caregiver, not the nurse, just the daughter. The little girl who sat on her father's lap and listened to made-up stories about dragons that lived in closets and chickens that laid golden eggs. He had a wild imagination. He told me that when he was a boy, he had caught a lightning bolt with his bare hands, that he once conversed with a jaguar in the jungle, and that the jaguar had given him advice he never forgot. Always take care of your loved ones, because they are all you truly have. I believed it all. And even though today I know they were stories, I carry them in my heart as if they were absolute truths. My father wasn't a perfect man. He had a strong character. Sometimes he argued with my mother over minor things. He got angry when he lost his keys or when the remote control didn't work. But he always knew how to apologize. And that, for me, was worth more than anything else. He taught me that making mistakes isn't the problem. The problem is not having the courage to admit it. He taught me to look people in the eye, to speak the truth even if it hurts, to never give up even when everything seems against you. Every corner of this house holds a trace of him. The tools still neatly arranged in the garage, the vinyl records that no longer spin but which he used to clean with devotion, the plaid shirt hanging on the left side of the closet, untouched, as if he were still going to wear it to work. His scent is still there, between the folds, between the seams, like a silent witness to the man he once was. Sometimes I find myself talking to him as if he could understand everything. I tell him about my day, about the new nurse we hired, about the child who recovered after a difficult surgery. I tell him about my fears, my doubts, my tiredness. And although he doesn't always respond, sometimes he looks at me differently, as if deep within him, something still recognizes me. As if his soul is telling me not to go, to stay here with me, even if I don't know your name. There are days when guilt weighs on me. I wonder if I'm doing enough, if I should quit work to spend more time with him, if I could do more to slow down the inevitable. But then I remember that's what love is too. To stay, to be there, to care without expecting anything in return. And that's what I do. Every day, every hour, even if it hurts, even if it tears me apart inside. On our refrigerator, stuck with a magnet, is a drawing I made of him when I was 7. It's a clumsy, thick-lined drawing of him and me holding hands, with a sun in the top corner and a huge heart in the center. He's kept it all these years. He framed it when I turned 20, and now it's one of the few objects he still points to and says, "That's cute." He doesn't know I did it. He doesn't remember the afternoon I proudly handed it to him, but something in that drawing still speaks to him, and that's enough. Alzheimer's doesn't erase everything at once. It takes things away little by little, like the sea that washes away the sand with each wave. Sometimes it comes back, sometimes it doesn't. There are days when it calls my name, and for a second, I think everything is okay, that I still have it, that I'm still its daughter. But those moments are getting rarer, more fragile, shorter, like a sigh in the middle of a storm. And yet, every time he looks at me, even if he doesn't know who I am, I recognize him, in the way he moves his hands, in the way he frowns when he doesn't like something, in the way he adjusts the blanket on his legs. He's still there, maybe buried under layers of confusion, but there. And as long as there's a trace of him, as long as his body allows me to hold him, I'll still be here, holding him, reminding him with my presence of what his memory can no longer hold. Because even if he forgets everything, even if his mind goes out like a candle in the dark, I will never stop being his daughter. I will never stop loving that man who taught me that the greatest strength is not in the hands, but in the heart. My father's name was Salvador Hernandez. He had large, work-hardened hands, with fingers that knew how to build houses and also how to caress tenderly. He always carried a tape measure in his pocket and a notebook where he jotted down ideas, measurements, and things he needed to do. I used to tell him he was like an oak tree, strong, firm, with deep roots that supported the entire family. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, each sentence carried weight. His voice had that deep tone that commanded respect and at the same time brought calm. He never shouted. He didn't need to. His mere presence was enough to tidy a room. I remember when I was a little girl, climbing on his shoulders felt like I could touch the sky. We would walk through the park while he pointed out the clouds and made up stories about what lay beyond. He told me that good giants lived up there who looked after children and that each star was a promise that would one day be fulfilled. I believed everything he said, not because they were believable stories, but because they came from him, and that was enough for me. When I was 7, he taught me how to ride a bike. He held me by the seat from behind, racing down the dirt road in our neighborhood. He told me to trust in yourself and your legs, and when he let go, I didn't know until I was pedaling alone. That was always his way, holding you without you even noticing, letting you go when you knew how to fly, but never completely letting go. He was always close, watching, ready to catch me if I fell. He worked as a carpenter for a construction company that built modest homes for Latino families in South Florida. He left home at 5:30 in the morning, carrying his metal lunchbox and faded blue cap. Sometimes he came home covered in dust, with splinters in his hands and the smell of fresh wood on his clothes. That scent, to this day, reminds me of him more than any perfume. When he arrived home, he would sit in his favorite chair, turn on the old living room fan, and put on a cassette of old music. He liked boleros and the songs of Jose Jose. He said that music had soul, that it sang what one didn't dare say out loud. On weekends, he cooked. It was his ritual. He prepared roast beef, rice and beans, and handmade tortillas. He taught me that food isn't just to fill the stomach, but to bring people together, to heal, to give thanks. While he cooked, he sang. And while he sang, he told me stories of his childhood in El Salvador, of the mango trees he climbed, of his grandmother who made homemade bread, of the river where he learned to swim. His eyes shone when he talked about his homeland, even though he hadn't visited it in years. He never said so, but I knew it pained him to have left so much behind. My mother always said he was a man of principles, and that's why he was sometimes stubborn. He didn't like injustice. He was once fired from a job because he stood up for a coworker who wouldn't get paid. He didn't regret it. He said respect isn't negotiable. I learned from him that dignity comes at a price, but sleeping with a clear conscience is priceless. He never wanted luxuries. He never sought recognition. But every nail he hammered, every table he built, every tear he wiped from me was his silent way of saying, "I'm here for you." In our house, there were no expensive toys or exotic trips, but there were stories at the foot of the bed. There were hugs in the midst of storms. There was shared silence that needed no explanation. I remember one time I came down with chicken pox and couldn't sleep because of the itching. He sat on the edge of my bed and read me an old book, holding a flashlight because the power had gone out. He read until he fell asleep, holding the flashlight. I fell asleep listening to his voice. It's one of my sweetest memories. When I turned 15, he gave me a small wooden box he'd made himself. Inside was a handwritten letter telling me I was the light of his life, that the world could be cruel, but he'd always be on my side. I still have that letter. I've read it so many times that the writing is worn. But every time I read it, I hear his voice in my mind, clear, firm, loving. There was something about the way my father looked at me that made me feel capable of anything. When I graduated from college, I saw him cry for the first time. It wasn't a boisterous cry. It was a single tear that fell as he hugged me. He told me, "You did it, daughter. You did it on your own." But I knew it wasn't true. I wouldn't have achieved any of it without his sacrifice, without his love, without his blind faith in me. He didn't talk about his pain. He kept everything to himself. The death of his brother, the years of poverty, the disappointments, the exhaustion of his body. He hid it all behind a smile, a joke, a long silence staring out the window. But when he thought no one was looking, the cracks showed, in the way he caressed my mother's photo, in the way he stood at the door when I left, as if afraid I wouldn't return, in the times he spoke to the plants in the garden as if they were old friends. If anything defined him, it was loyalty. To his people, to his values, to his history. He never betrayed anyone. He never raised his voice to humiliate anyone. He never refused help. Sometimes he ran out of money to lend to others. Sometimes he worked overtime so I wouldn't lack anything. He wasn't perfect, but he was good. And that, in this world, is increasingly rare. One of his favorite sayings was, "He who sows love reaps strength." I didn't fully understand what that meant when I was a child, but now I know. He sowed love every day, in every gesture, in every effort, in every word he didn't say but felt. And thanks to that, now that everything is falling apart inside his mind, I have the strength to hold him up. Today, when I see him in his chair, his gaze lost, struggling to make sense of his surroundings, I cling to that memory of who he was. Because even if Alzheimer's takes his memories, I won't let it take mine. Because he remains that giant of a man, even if his body no longer remembers him. Because what he built in me is stronger than any illness. Because my father, my savior, wasn't just the man who raised me. He was and remains the cornerstone of everything I am. It all started with small, seemingly harmless cracks, details anyone could overlook, a key I couldn't find, a misspoken name, a plate left on the table for hours. They were tiny, almost insignificant things that, under any other circumstances, one would attribute to fatigue, stress, or age. But deep inside, something told me this was deeper, darker, more dangerous. Because I knew my father. I knew how his mind worked. And suddenly, it had stopped working the way it used to. I remember the first time I noticed something odd. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had come home from work, exhausted, and he was standing in the kitchen, staring at the open refrigerator. The milk was sitting out, already warm. I asked him what was wrong. He looked at me confused, as if he couldn't remember why he was there. Then he smiled and said, "I came to get some water, but I forgot." We laughed. I made a joke about my age, and he responded with an old joke about brains on strike. But when I turned to put the milk away, I saw him scratching his head, worried. There was fear in his eyes, a mild, silent fear, like the kind you feel when you're lost on a familiar street and can't understand how you got there. The next day, he left the gas on. He'd tried to heat water for coffee but forgot to turn on the stove. The smell alerted me from the hallway. I asked him if he was feeling okay. He said yes, that he was distracted. But his voice no longer had its usual firmness. It was a voice with cracks. That same week, I found him looking for his glasses in the oven. They were in his shirt, hanging as always. But he didn't feel them. He asked me if someone had broken in to steal them. I laughed, trying to make light of the matter, but inside, a silence chilled my chest. Little by little, the mistakes began to multiply. He put the toothpaste in the refrigerator. He kept his socks in the microwave. He put his shirt on inside out. He mixed up the days. He called me by my mother's name and then corrected himself with a tight smile. He started using sticky notes all over the house, handwritten reminders with phrases like, "Turn off the light," or "Today is Monday." I tried not to panic. I told him we all forget things, that it was normal. But the truth is, none of it was normal. One morning, I woke up and he wasn't home anymore. The door was ajar. I ran out, in my bathrobe, barefoot, my heart racing. I found him 3 blocks away, standing on the corner, staring at the traffic light as if it were a hieroglyph. When he saw me, he freaked out. He told me he was on his way to work. He'd been retired for over 10 years. I hugged him tight. I felt his body tremble, not just from the cold, but from confusion. He apologized. He told me something wasn't right. It was the first time I'd heard him admit it, and in his eyes, there was a mixture of shame and sadness that I'll never forget. After that, I decided to start a log. I wrote down every forgetfulness, every episode, every confused word, every blank stare. I felt like a detective in my own home, observing everything, connecting pieces, trying to put together a puzzle that fell apart as I built it. I didn't want to panic. I didn't want to assume the worst. But deep down, I already knew. Even if I didn't have a diagnosis, my heart already knew. One afternoon, while we were washing dishes together, he asked me if I had any siblings. I froze. I'd always been an only child. I laughed nervously and said no. He looked thoughtful. He said he thought he remembered a boy, that they played together, that he looked after him. I felt a knot in my stomach. Maybe he was talking about a cousin, or maybe his mind was already mixing eras, faces, memories. I asked him if that boy's name was Camilla. He looked at me. He didn't say anything. He just smiled, as if he didn't understand the question. As the weeks passed, the confusion became more evident. He called me Mom. He asked if I'd eaten even though we'd just finished dinner. He got angry when I told him I wasn't working anymore. He complained to me for not letting him know it was his birthday. Dates no longer existed for him. Time was a loose thread slipping through his fingers. I tried to keep up with him. Not to always correct him, not to make him feel stupid, but I didn't always succeed. There were days when I despaired, when I wanted to scream, cry, run away, but I swallowed my tears and smiled at him, because it wasn't his fault. He was the victim of something he couldn't control. One day I took him to the market and he got lost in the aisles. When I found him, he was crying, hugging a woman he didn't know. He kept telling her, "Mom, don't leave me again." The woman was bewildered. So was I. I took him home trembling. He didn't remember anything, and I felt for the first time a profound fear. Fear of what was to come. Fear of how far that silent darkness that enveloped him could go. I tried to talk to him about going to the doctor. He refused. He said he wasn't crazy, that he just needed to rest. I explained that wasn't it, that we just wanted to understand what was going on. But he wouldn't accept it. For him, admitting something was wrong was giving up. And my father never gave up. So I started doing research on my own, reading, looking for signs. I joined an online group for family members of people with Alzheimer's. I read testimonials, stories identical to mine. I saw myself reflected in every word. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone. But I also knew this wasn't temporary, that there was no cure, that it could only get worse. And so, I began to prepare, to ask difficult questions. What will happen when he no longer recognizes me? What will I do when he can't dress himself? How long will I be able to continue caring for him alone? And even though I didn't have answers yet, I knew I had to be strong, that I had to anticipate the storm before it completely swept me away. The final sign, the most brutal, came one winter night. I'd had a bad day at work. I'd arrived late, tired, heartbroken. I walked into the house and saw him sitting in the living room with the lights off. I went over to hug him, but he abruptly pulled away. He yelled at me, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" He told me he didn't know me, that he didn't have a daughter, that his daughter was away. He pushed me. He looked at me as if I were a thief, an imposter, a threat. That night, I slept on the couch, not out of fear, but out of pain, from that invisible wound that was beginning to bleed nonstop. From that moment on, I knew I could no longer deny the obvious, that I had to face reality with my eyes open, because what was coming wasn't going to be easy, and because even if he began to forget who I was, I would never forget that he was my father, and that I deserved to be cared for with the same tenderness with which he cared for me all my life. The diagnosis came in a white room, redolent of disinfectant and filled with heavy silence. A young neurologist, with a serene but direct gaze, greeted us with papers in his hand and words he tried unsuccessfully to soften. My father looked around with distrust, as if the place were part of a plan he didn't want to be a part of. He squeezed my hand tightly. That was one of the last times I felt him so present, aware, connected to me, because when the doctor said the word Alzheimer's, it was as if an invisible sentence had been sealed, a wound that was already bleeding from within, but now had a name. I didn't react immediately. It was like hearing something in another language. I felt like my soul was floating through the ceiling while my body sat there feigning composure. My father frowned. He said he didn't understand. He asked if this was serious. The doctor spoke to him patiently, explaining that it was a degenerative disease that affected memory, judgment, and language, but he only half listened. He settled on one sentence. "So, am I going to go crazy?" I took his hand and told him no, that I wasn't crazy, that I was sick, that we were going to face it together. But deep down, I already felt alone. We left the hospital in silence. I remember the sun was bright, but the day seemed gray. Cars passed by as if the world didn't realize my father had just lost his future. We walked toward the parking lot, and he asked me where we were going. I told him home. He said, "Which home?" That's when I understood that Alzheimer's wasn't a disease of time. It was a disease of space, of identity, of belonging. It didn't just take away memories. It took away a sense of belonging. Home was no longer home. The body was no longer a body. History was unraveling before your eyes. The following weeks were a brutal combination of denial, anger, and sadness. Sometimes he refused to take the medication. He said he didn't need it, that he felt fine, Other times he took it resignedly, without question, like someone drinking poison to avoid an argument. The doctor had warned us there would be ups and downs, good days and terrible days, but I never imagined the terrible days could hurt so much. The sleepless nights began. He would wake up at 3 a.m, thinking it was daytime. He would get dressed, put on his old cap, and say he was going to work. I would follow him, hug him, explain that it was nighttime. Sometimes he would cry. Sometimes he would get angry. Once, he tried to climb out the window because he thought we were locked in. His hands were shaking. He would shout names I didn't recognize. And I, desperate, could only hold him and repeat that he was safe, that everything was okay, even though I knew it wasn't. The bathroom became a battlefield. He refused to let me help him. He was ashamed of me. He pushed me, insulted me. He told me he wasn't my father, that I didn't have the right. But as soon as I left him alone, he forgot how water worked. He'd stare at the faucet, confused. Once, he came out with shampoo still in his hair. Another time, he tried to shave with a spoon. And every time that happened, I swallowed my tears, gritted my teeth, and said softly, "Come on, Dad, let me help you, like when you used to help me." He lost control of his words. He confused concepts. He called the sofa a bed, the door a window. He said, "I'm cold" when he was hungry, or "I'm thirsty" when he wanted to sleep. Sometimes he laughed alone. Other times he stared at the wall for hours without blinking. He talked to people who weren't there. He heard non-existent noises. And I had to pretend everything was okay, that I understood, that I could handle it all, even though inside I was falling apart. One of the hardest moments was when she stopped recognizing her own reflection. She would look in the mirror and ask who that man was. She would get scared. She told me someone was in the house. I covered all the mirrors. I couldn't bear to see her fear, because it wasn't just forgetfulness. It was terror. It was disorientation. It was as if her mind had been thrown into a place with no maps, no light, no way out. One day, he called me by another name. He called me Rosa. I'd never met any Rosa. I asked him who I was. He told me I was his wife. I told him his wife's name was Maria, my mother. He looked at me confused. He said that wasn't true, that Maria was his sister. I stayed silent. There was no point in correcting him anymore. Every correction was a fight. Every truth was a loss. So I learned to play his game, to enter his world, to respond like Rosa if it calmed him, to make up stories to give him peace. Because sometimes compassion lies in letting go of logic and embracing tenderness. Everything began to revolve around strict routines. The same schedule for everything. Medication, food, rest. I made him a notebook with drawings explaining each step. I used colors, stickers, short phrases, as if he were a child again. I celebrated every small victory. That he could put on his shoes. That he knew how to use a spoon. That he looked at me and smiled. Those moments became treasures. Moments of light amid so much shadow. I started keeping a journal. Not just to vent, but to remember. Because I, too, began to forget. I forgot the last time I'd slept well. I forgot what it was like to be alone, in silence without fear. I forgot the woman I was before becoming their caregiver. Because caring for someone with Alzheimer's is becoming a living memory. A bridge, a guardian, an echo of a story the other can no longer sustain. The pain didn't come just from seeing him like that. It came from imagining the future, from knowing that I would lose him little by little, that a day would come when he wouldn't know how to walk or speak or swallow, that there would be diapers, catheters, screams, that his body would become a prison for a soul that would no longer know how to escape. And yet, I loved him more than ever, because his fragility reminded me of everything he had been strong for me, because his silence spoke to me of everything I could no longer say, because his lost gaze was still searching for something, and I would be there, waiting, in case he ever found me again. I'll never forget the afternoon my father looked at me with eyes filled with terrifying innocence and asked in a trembling voice, "Who are you? Where is my daughter?" I froze. Time stopped. Everything around me disappeared. It was as if someone had turned off the light of his soul right in front of me. For a few seconds, all I could do was breathe heavily, trying to hold back the tears that were building up without permission. I approached slowly, took his hands, and said with a lump in my throat, "It's me, Dad. I'm Camilla. I'm your daughter." He frowned, stared at me as if searching for some familiar trace on my face, and then looked away in confusion, muttering, "No, you're not her." She was younger. She was singing in the kitchen. I felt as if my heart had been ripped out with bare hands. That was the first time he completely erased me. Not just my name or my story, but everything we had shared. The breakfasts of toast and orange juice, the walks to the park, the silent hugs after my failures, the Sundays of old movies and salty popcorn. All of that had disappeared for him as if it had never existed. I sat beside him, breathing deeply, and softly sang the same song he used to sing to me when I was a little girl, Cucuracucu Paloma. For a moment he closed his eyes. He seemed to calm down, but when he opened them, he looked at me again with that emptiness that tore at me. It was then that I realized I had crossed an invisible line from which there was no turning back. From that day on, something changed inside me. It wasn't enough to be strong anymore. I had to learn to be invisible, to be present without expecting recognition, to care without receiving thanks, to love someone who didn't know I loved them. It was a slow, painful process full of contradictions. Some mornings I woke up energetically determined to do everything with tenderness. I carefully prepared his breakfast, dressed him in his favorite shirt, and spoke to him patiently. But other times, tiredness overcame me. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself. It was as if I, too, were slowly fading away in that house full of shadows. The seizures became more frequent. He began talking to himself out loud and having hallucinations. He said he saw people in the living room. Sometimes he screamed that he was being watched. He locked himself in his room. He asked me to call his mother, who had been dead for more than 30 years. He told me he had to go, that he had to get back to his carpentry job. One early morning, I found him with a suitcase full of socks and newspapers, thinking he had a train to catch. I sat on the floor next to him and told him a made-up story about how the train was delayed and we were supposed to wait together. He looked at me, and for a second, I thought he believed me. Then I put my head on his shoulder and pretended everything was okay, even though inside I felt like I was falling apart. Feeding also became a challenge. He forgot to chew. He choked. He couldn't recognize flavors. One day he told me the rice tasted like dirt. Another day he spat out his soup, saying it was poisoned. I started blending his food, using plastic cutlery, and cutting everything into tiny pieces. I learned to identify signs of fatigue just by how he held the spoon. Sometimes I fed him like a child while telling him old stories, trying to distract him. I told him about when we went to the beach and he built sandcastles taller than me. I told him about when he taught me to salsa dance in the living room and he laughed when I stumbled. Sometimes he responded with a mumble. Other times he just stared out the window, as if waiting for someone who would never arrive. There was one particular night that still haunts me. I woke with a start because of a noise. I ran to his room and found him kneeling on the floor crying. I asked him what was wrong and he said he'd lost something very important. I asked him what it was. He said he didn't remember. I held him tight as he trembled. I told him that what he'd lost wasn't alone, that I would keep it for him. That night we slept on the floor, cuddled like two shipwrecked souls clinging to a fading shared memory. At dawn, he looked at me with glassy eyes and said something I'll never forget. "Thank you for not leaving me alone." Little by little, I stopped taking him to the park. He could no longer walk without stumbling. His steps became slow and clumsy. We used a wheelchair, but even that made him uncomfortable. He said he was being pushed into the void. He began to reject physical contact. He couldn't stand being touched. He pushed me away even when I tried to stroke his hair. He yelled at me, "Don't touch me!" And then he apologized through tears. It was like living with two different people, the father I remembered and the stranger who now inhabited his body. And yet it was still him. In those frightened eyes, there was still the man who taught me to love unconditionally. The illness also brought with it moments of unexpected tenderness. Once, I played music for him. and he began to move his fingers as if conducting an invisible orchestra. I approached and saw him smile. I asked him what he was listening to, and he told me Mom's song. It was a bolero that used to play on the radio when I was a child. I took his hand, and we danced right there in the kitchen, clumsily amidst the furniture and silence. For a few minutes, time stood still. The illness receded, and he was himself again, if only for the brief sigh of a song. I began to understand that love in these circumstances isn't measured by reciprocity. It's measured by the ability to remain, to endure, to accompany someone in their fall without trying to stop it, only to cushion it. I became adept at translating gestures, understanding his silences, anticipating his needs before he expressed them. I became his voice, his feet, his memory, but above all, his refuge. And that was all I could offer him, a safe space where he could forget without fear. At the end of the day, when he finally fell asleep and his breathing became regular, I would sit beside him and speak softly. Even though he didn't respond, I told him how much I loved him. I thanked him for everything he was, for everything he taught me, for being the father I needed. And deep down, I hoped that, somewhere in his mind, those words would resonate, that he would know he wasn't alone, that even if the whole world forgot him, I never would, because he gave me his life, and now it was my turn to hold his. Even if it vanished in my arms like sand through my fingers. The days began to merge. The calendar lost meaning. The seasons were erased. It no longer mattered whether it was Monday or Saturday, spring or winter. We lived in a continuous present where every minute was an emotional roller coaster. I became my father's shadow. I couldn't stray more than a few feet from him without him beginning to stir or calling out to me in a tone of anguish so deep it tore at my soul. He needed me all the time, not just to eat or bathe, but to exist, as if my presence was the only thread that still tied him to reality. His body began to change. He lost weight drastically. The muscles that had once been able to carry wooden boards with strength now couldn't hold even a cup. He hunched over. He walked with a shuffle. His knees ached. He struggled to get up. Sometimes he fell. Other times he sat for hours without moving. His skin became more fragile. He bruised easily. His eyes blurred. He could no longer distinguish faces or objects. He said the house was darker than before. I replaced the light bulbs with brighter ones. I removed furniture. I put grab bars in the bathroom. I turned the house into a kind of makeshift clinical retreat. And yet, I still felt like it was never enough. One afternoon, he began to babble things I didn't understand, words out of order, syllables that didn't end. I thought it was fatigue. But soon, he stopped talking altogether. He only made guttural sounds. He stared with his lips pursed. Words had completely disappeared. Communication was reduced to gestures, expressions, grunts. I learned to read his eyes, to interpret the trembling of his hands, the furrowing of his brow. He no longer told me if he was hungry or cold. I guessed. I sensed it. Like one senses the weather or a feeling, I became the translator of his silence. He began to have aggressive episodes. He pushed me when I bathed him. He scratched me when I tried to change his clothes. He screamed at me with a rage I'd never seen in him before. It was as if his soul was struggling to leave a body he no longer recognized, as if there was a constant storm inside him, and he was merely the vessel containing that chaos. Once, he threw a cup at me. Another time, he locked himself in the bathroom for hours and wouldn't come out. I spoke to him tenderly. I sang to him. I said phrases I used to repeat when he was lucid. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. The doctors said it was part of the process, that it was normal. Normal. What an absurd word. None of it was normal. It wasn't normal to see the man who taught you to ride a bike tremble like a child hearing thunder. It wasn't normal to have to change the diapers of the man who once changed yours. It wasn't normal to prepare food and not remember how to use a spoon. But that was my new normal. A routine built on pain and compassion. Bathing became one of the most difficult moments. He resisted bathing. He said the water followed him, that the shower was a trap. I tried to convince him gently. I led him to the bathroom slowly. I played music. Sometimes I managed to bathe him in parts. One day, his torso. Another day, his legs. With warm sponges. With slow movements. I talked to him all the time. I told him stories of when we used to go to the lake, of when he jumped into the water with his clothes on just to make me laugh. I spoke to him as if he were still there, as if his soul could still hear me from the depths of that fog. The nights were the worst, the so-called sundowning. At dusk, he would stir. He would pace aimlessly around the house. He would say he had to leave, that they were waiting for him, that something bad was going to happen. He wouldn't sleep. I would sit with him on the couch until exhaustion overcame him. Sometimes he would talk in his sleep. He would say names I didn't recognize. He would pray. He would cry. He would hold me tight. He would tell me not to leave me. And I promised him I wouldn't. Although sometimes, in the depths of my pain, I longed to escape. Just for a day. For an hour. To breathe. To remember who I was before I became my father's caregiver. Guilt was a constant presence. I felt bad when I got angry, when I lost my temper, when I raised my voice, when I needed a break. I felt guilty for being tired, for being sleepy, for wanting to cry in the bathroom without him seeing. But I also learned that that was human, that loving someone at their worst doesn't mean being invincible. It means being there even when everything hurts, even when there's no gratitude or acknowledgement or hope. Just love. Pure love. Unconditional. I started looking for support. I joined a caregiver group. People who were going through the same thing. We shared stories. We gave each other advice. We listened without judgment. It was a relief. For the first time, I felt like someone truly understood me. I learned techniques to calm him, to feed him, to prevent falls. They recommended stimulation exercises, memory games, aromatherapy. Some things worked, others didn't, but at least I didn't feel alone anymore. I made a mural in our house with photos of him, his younger self, his middle-aged self, with Mom, with me, images of happy times. I thought they might help him remember, reconnect, ground him. Sometimes he looked at them and smiled. Other times he said nothing. But I still believed that somewhere deep in his heart, those images opened a secret door to who he had been. Every time I saw him asleep, I leaned close to his ear and said, "I love you, Dad. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for still being here. Thank you for everything." I don't know if he heard it. I don't know if he understood it. But I needed to tell him, as if each word were a seed that could one day blossom within that darkness. And even though his body grew more fragile and his mind more distant, I continued to find ways to make him feel loved. I brought him flowers from the garden. I sang him boleros. I read him poems. I dressed him in his favorite shirt. I applied perfume. I combed his hair carefully, as if those small acts were sacred rituals, as if with every gesture I told him, "You're still you. You're still worthy. You're still here. And I'm with you. Until my last breath." There was a day when something changed forever. It wasn't just the name confusion or the restless nights. It was the day my father stopped walking. His body no longer responded. It was sudden, as if an internal switch had been turned off. That morning, he tried to get up to go to the bathroom and simply fell. There was no strength in his legs, no warning, just a loud thud against the floor and a scream that still echoes in my memory. I ran to his side and lifted him up with difficulty, and seeing his face, I knew he too had understood that something definitive had just happened. He cried silently, without saying a word. He cried not because of the physical pain, but because of that invisible loss that had just marked a before and after. That was the last time he stood on his own. From then on, a new stage began, an even harder one in which dependence became absolute, where there was no longer the slightest space for autonomy. We acquired an orthopedic bed with rails. We installed a portable hoist. We called in a nurse to guide us through transfer techniques. Every daily action became a logistical and emotional challenge. Dressing him was a complex choreography. Changing his diapers required strength, patience, and a lot of love. Feeding him was an act of precision. Everything had to be at the exact right temperature, with the perfect texture, and in minimal portions. His digestive system had become slow and fragile. Every bite had to be supervised. Every sip had to be accompanied by water. Alzheimer's doesn't just erase memories. It also robs him of vital functions. He couldn't swallow properly anymore. Sometimes food went down the wrong path. He coughed hard, choked, and looked at me fearfully. I had to gently massage his throat and speak gently. "You're okay, Dad. I'm here." And the worst part was seeing how his gaze no longer sought to understand, but only to trust. Because even though he didn't know who I was, I knew he was safe by my side. And that was always my greatest responsibility, to protect his dignity, even when everything else fell apart. There were days when he didn't open his eyes. He remained motionless, as if asleep, but not really. I called him by name, caressed his face, and played his favorite music close to his ears. Sometimes a tear rolled down his cheek. Other times, a slight movement of his lips made me think he was trying to say something. I clung to those small gestures as if they were miracles, as if a hidden part of his soul still held fast within them. His skin became extremely sensitive. It reddened easily. He developed sores from lying down for so long. I began rotating him every 2 hours, regardless of the time of day or night. I did this with extreme care, like someone handling a piece of antique crystal. I applied soothing creams and oils and wrapped him in soft blankets. I talked to him while I did this so he wouldn't feel alone. Even if he didn't respond, I knew something inside him could still sense my presence. During those long nights of caregiving, while he slept with labored breathing and the monitors whispered his vital signs, I sat beside him and wrote. Not letters or diaries. I wrote little notes for him, as if I might someday read them again. I told him about my day, what flowers I'd seen when I walked out into the garden, what the clouds looked like that evening. I told him about my childhood, about the stories he told me when I was a little girl, and in every word, I gave back a little of what he'd given me. Love, in the form of memory. One afternoon, while changing her clothes, I stopped when I saw a scar on her back. I didn't remember it. I touched it gently and was filled with a deep sense of respect. That mark was a trace of her story, a silent fragment of her past. I thought about everything she had lived through, everything she had overcome, and then I understood that even though her mind could no longer remember it, her body bore witness to her life, and that, too, was a form of immortality. We received visitors, but they were becoming fewer and fewer. Some family members didn't know how to act. They remained silent. They spoke too loudly. They asked him questions that were impossible to answer. He looked at them, uncomprehending. I learned to filter who could enter our little universe. Only those who came with love, without expectations, without needing to be acknowledged. Because at that stage, true love wasn't the kind that didn't demand to be named. The kind that was simply there, holding us, without asking for anything in return. Sometimes they asked me how I endured so much. I just smiled. Because it wasn't about enduring, it was about loving. Loving in its purest, most painful, most real form. Loving without waiting for a response, without knowing if there was gratitude, without certainties. Loving with my body, with my mind, with my soul. Loving the way he had loved me when I was a baby, defenseless, fragile, without words. Now it was my turn to return that love unconditionally. And even though I often felt exhausted, cried in the bathroom, longed for a day off, a night of deep sleep, just seeing his relaxed face was enough to understand that I was doing the right thing, that every second was worth it, that every caress, every song, every word were seeds I planted in his heart, invisible seeds that might not have blossomed for him, but that gave me the strength to carry on. In the midst of the pain, I found a strange peace, a peace that came from the certainty of doing what I should, from knowing that I was accompanying my father to the end of the road with dignity, with tenderness, with presence, and that was all I could offer him, all I had left, and also all that mattered. Because love, when given entirely, transforms even the cruelest of goodbyes into an act of beauty. The clock became a symbolic object in the house, always telling the time, but not truly mattering. Because when someone you love loses all sense of time, you begin to lose it too. You stop living for the calendar. You start living for the moments. The small ones. The invisible ones. The ones only you can notice. Like the slight movement of her fingers as she felt the sun on her skin. Like the way her eyebrow arched when she heard a familiar noise. I learned to read those signals as if they were complete sentences. I became adept at translating what wasn't said. Every day was a silent battle. A battle against the constant infections. Against the bed sores that appeared no matter how hard I tried. Against physical exhaustion. Against the fear of losing him at any moment. And above all, against being forgotten. Because being forgotten didn't just belong to him. It was also beginning to inhabit me. I forgot my reflection. I forgot the words I used to use. I forgot my own story. As if, in the process of caring for someone with Alzheimer's, a part of you also began to blur. One day, as I stroked his forehead, I noticed his temperature was higher than normal. I called the doctor. He had a fever, a urinary tract infection. They started him on antibiotics. I isolated him even further from the outside world to protect him. I stopped receiving visitors. I became a kind of human barrier between him and any threat. He didn't complain. He didn't protest. But I knew something in his body was shutting down more quickly. His eyes no longer reacted like they used to. His breathing was heavier, slower, deeper, as if with each inhalation, his soul decided if it wanted to stay a little longer. In those days, I discovered a side of myself I hadn't known before. A mix of warrior and nurse. Between daughter and mother. Because I did. I became his mother. I fed him. I cleaned him. I sang him to sleep. I soothed him with gentle words. I hugged him when he cried. And in the midst of all that, I was still his daughter. The girl he once carried on his shoulders. The one who carried his snack in her backpack. The one who fell asleep in the back seat of the car while he drove singing. I started writing him letters he'd never read. I told him how much I admired him. I told him I forgave him for the times he failed to show his love. I thanked him for all the times he stood up for me without words. I confessed that I was afraid. That I didn't know what I would do when he was gone. That I didn't know how I'd ever return to my normal life. Because after caring for someone to that extent, there's no going back. Your skin changes. Your gaze changes. Your soul changes. There was an early morning I'll never forget. I woke up to a strange silence. It was different. It wasn't the usual nighttime silence. It was a profound silence, as if something in the air had changed. I went to his room. He was asleep, or so I thought at first. I approached him. I spoke to him. He didn't respond. I touched his hand. It was warm. His breathing was so soft it was barely noticeable. I sat beside him. I watched him for hours, with fear, with love, with a strange peace, as if he knew the moment was coming. Days passed with no improvement. He barely ate. He barely drank water. His body was beginning to reject life. And I was there, present, committed, strong on the outside, but broken on the inside. I refused to leave him alone for even a second. I slept by his side. I talked to him about my childhood. I told him what I saw outside the window. I described the colors of the sky, the smells of the kitchen, the songs playing on the radio, as if I could paint a picture with words of a world he could no longer see. In those days, I understood that death doesn't always come like a thief bursting in violently. Sometimes it comes like an old friend who silently comes to take away someone who can no longer hold on. And I also understood that dying isn't just about stopping breathing. Sometimes you die in life, and sometimes there is beauty in that death too, because love has the ability to transform farewell into a sacred act. Every morning, I took his hand and placed it over my heart. I told him I was okay, that he could rest, that I was going to be okay, that he'd done enough, that I loved him with every part of me. And even though his eyes no longer opened, even though his body barely moved, I swore those words reached him, like a whisper between dimensions, like a promise that pierces the skin and reaches straight to the soul. I often wondered if I was doing the right thing, if there was anything more I could do. But every time I doubted it, all I had to remember was the look in his eyes before Alzheimer's took him away completely. That strong, confident gaze that said, without speaking, "Take care of those you love. Don't give up." And that's what I did. I didn't give up. Even if it hurt. Even if I was bleeding out inside. Even if the world kept turning as if nothing were happening. I was there, being his anchor, his support, his memory, his refuge. And then something strange happened. I began to feel peace, not because everything was right, but because everything had been done with love. And that's all that matters in the end. The love with which you care, with which you accompany, with which you are, even when the other can no longer see you. Because true love doesn't need to be reciprocated. It only needs to be given. And I gave it to them. Everything. Until my last breath. The room smelled of lavender. I always put a few drops of essential oil in the humidifier because it reminded me of my childhood. Of the days when Mom would open the windows and let the sun fill everything with light. It was a way to summon something familiar amidst so much unknown. My father lay with his eyes closed. He breathed slowly. His chest rose and fell as if each inhalation were a conversation with life. I sat beside him with my hand on his. There was no need to speak. The silence had a voice of its own. A deep, sad, sweet voice. That day I knew something was ending. Not because of a medical sign or a clinical finding. It was something more instinctive. A feeling that came from deep within, as if his soul were packing its bags to leave. And yet there was no sadness. There was a profound respect for that moment. A feeling of accompanying someone on their final journey. As if they were crossing an invisible bridge, and I could see them from the shore just a few steps behind. I talked to him for hours, not about important things or deep reflections. I talked to him about us, about how he used to take me to school on his bike, about how he taught me how to fix an electrical outlet without electrocuting me, about the time he defended me from an unfair teacher, about how he cried at my graduation without anyone noticing, about the soup he made when I was sick, about the letters he wrote me on notebook paper. I spoke to him as if I were painting his life with words, as if each sentence were a brushstroke of memory that covered him with dignity and love. Outside, the world kept turning. I heard cars, children playing, and a distant bird's song. Everything continued, as if it didn't know that in that room, time was unraveling. I wondered how many people at that moment were losing someone without knowing it. How many hugs unsaid, how many words unspoken, how many goodbyes silenced by routine, by fear, by haste. And I felt grateful, because I was there, seeing it, feeling it, accompanying it, with every cell in my body. I played his favorite song, an old bolero, one of those that spoke of eternal love. His expression changed. A slight smile spread across his face. A tear trickled down his cheek. And I felt that for a moment he knew. He knew he wasn't alone. He knew he was loved, that his life had been worthwhile, that his story had been told and heard, that even though his memory was gone, the essential thing was still there, vibrating between the walls, between my hands, between our souls. I remembered something he once told me when I was a teenager and feeling lost. He told me the only thing they can't take away from you is what you give with love. And he was right, because even now, when there was no more strength, words, or conscience, he continued to give love, in his silence, in his fragility, in his simple existence. He was a presence that taught. That left a mark. That left a mark without needing to make a sound. I leaned close to his ear and told him he could go, that everything was okay, that he'd done a beautiful job, that I was going to be okay, that I would always carry him with me, that every time I looked up at the sky, I would look for a sign from him, that every time I sang one of his songs, I would feel him near, that there was no end, only a transformation, only a new way of being. And then I felt his last exhalation, slow and deep, like a sigh that spoke volumes. His face softened, his body relaxed, and in that instant, I knew he was gone. But I didn't feel empty. I felt full, as if a part of him had been imbued into every corner. As if love had won the battle against oblivion, because that's what happened. Love won. It won against Alzheimer's. It won against absence. It won against fear. I stayed next to him for a long time. I couldn't move. I didn't want to. I closed my eyes and let the memories wash over me. Not the painful ones, not the ones from the end, but the ones from the beginning. His laughter, his strong voice, his advice, his scolding, his hugs. Every scene flashed through my mind like a movie only I could see. And I cried. I cried from the depths of my being. But it was a clean cry, a healing one, because I knew I'd done the right thing, that I'd been there until the very last second, that I'd loved him the way he deserved. That night, I slept for the first time in weeks. I slept soundly, certain that I had fulfilled my mission. The next day, I began preparing for his farewell. I wanted it to be as dignified as his life. I called those who had loved him. I asked them to bring memories, anecdotes, and photos. We held an intimate ceremony, without ostentation, full of truth. We shared stories, we laughed, we cried, and above all, we honored him, not as the man who forgot, but as the man who loved, who taught, who left a mark on all who knew him. And that's when I realized something I'll never forget. Alzheimer's may erase memories, but it doesn't erase love, because love doesn't live in the mind. It lives in the soul. And that remains intact beyond everything. That's the part of us that continues to love even when the body shuts down. That's the greatest legacy anyone can leave. And my father left me his whole life. Complete, infinite. Like a light that never goes out. Like a hug that lasts forever. After her departure, the house became a place full of echoes. Every corner seemed to speak to me. The chair by the window where she sat in the afternoons with her blanket over her legs. The ceramic mug she always used even though it was cracked on one side. The framed photo in the living room where she used to hold me when I was just a little girl. Everything had her scent, her energy, her presence. And yet she was no longer there. Her absence wasn't just an empty space. It was a weight, one that settled in my chest with a mixture of deep love and overwhelming sadness. The first few days were slow, as if time were moving with difficulty. I had trouble sleeping. I had trouble eating. I had trouble speaking. I felt like I'd lost a part of myself that couldn't be recovered. But at the same time, I felt a strange peace. The peace that lets you know you did everything, that you were present, that you gave your best, that no words were left unspoken. That peace mingled with the pain, and together they formed a kind of serene silence. It wasn't resignation, it was acceptance. I began to find small rituals to stay connected to him. Every day when I woke up, I would open the curtains and quietly say, "Good morning, Dad." I would light a white candle in the kitchen, his favorite spot in the house. I would play his music. I would make coffee the way he liked it, strong, without sugar. I would sit with the cup in my hands and reminisce. Sometimes I would talk to him out loud. I would tell him how I felt. I told him I missed him, that I didn't know how to go on, but that I would try. Because that's what he taught me, to keep going, even when everything seems lost. I also encountered the emptiness of others. Some friends disappeared. Some family members didn't know what to say. They told me things like, "It's over now, you have to move on with your life," as if a wound of that magnitude could be healed with a single sentence. But I understood that grief isn't something others can fully understand. It's a lonely path, painful, intimate, and it's also a process of transformation, because a part of you dies, but another is born. And that part that's born is stronger, more compassionate, more human. One day while cleaning her room, I found an old box I hadn't seen before. It was under the bed. Inside were letters, photographs, and a notebook with her handwriting. They were written for me. Some from when I was a child, others more recent. Letters she'd never given me. One of them said, "If you're reading this, it's because I'm no longer here. But I don't want you to think about death. I want you to think about the life we had, about our laughter, about our conversations, about how we danced in the kitchen, about how you asked me strange questions when you were 5. That's what matters. That's what lasts." I read every word with tears in my eyes. His shaky handwriting, the way he wrote my name. his way of speaking to me as if he were right there in front of me. That box was an unexpected gift, a bridge between his soul and mine. It reminded me that love never dies, that it transforms, that it multiplies, that it lives on in the details, in the memories, in the gestures we repeat without realizing it. Little by little, I began to rebuild myself, to find myself again. I would go out into the garden and feel the sun speaking to me about him. I would walk around the city and every elderly person I saw would remind me of him. I volunteered at a senior citizen's home. I wanted to give back a little of the love I had received. I wanted to hug those who no longer had someone to hug them. I heard incredible stories. I cried with people I didn't know. And in each of those encounters, I felt my father lived a little longer. I learned that grief isn't a straight line. There are days when you can laugh freely and others when a song disarms you. And that's okay, because loving deeply also means hurting deeply. And that pain, although it may seem like a burden, is actually an honor, a testament to what was experienced, to what still resonates within you. One night I had a dream. We were walking together through a forest. He was strong, young, happy. He held my hand and told me to keep walking. "Daughter, don't look back. You're doing everything right." When I woke up, I felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude. I didn't know if it was a real message or just a figment of my mind in need of comfort. But I decided to believe that he was okay, that he saw me, that he was with me. And from then on, I began to live differently, more calmly, with more presence, appreciating the small things, a warm cup of tea, a heartfelt conversation, an unexpected caress. I learned to talk to other people who were caring for relatives with Alzheimer's. I told them my story. I listened to theirs. We created an invisible network of support and understanding, because no one understands that journey until they live it. And when you live it, you need to know you're not alone. Today, I continue to learn to live with his absence. Not a day goes by that I don't think about him. Not a moment that his image doesn't cross my mind. But there is also love. So much love. And that sustains me, because even though my father is no longer physically here, he remains my guide, my example, my root. In every important decision, I think about what he would do, and I almost always find the answer. Because when someone loves you deeply, they leave traces that neither Alzheimer's nor death can erase. And so I continue, walking, sometimes with a firm step, sometimes with stumbles, but always with my heart full of him, of his voice, of his tenderness, of his struggle, of his light, because that is the most powerful legacy anyone can leave. A light that never goes out, a flame that keeps burning, a story worth telling again and again, so that others may also find strength, hope, and comfort, so that love may continue to win battles even in the midst of oblivion. Thank you. That's the first word that springs to mind as I sit down to write the end of this story. Thank you for having come this far with me. Thank you for having listened not only to the story of a daughter who accompanied her father on his final journey, but also to the echo of millions of others who silently walk the same path. Stories like mine are lived in thousands of homes, in small apartments, in rural houses, in nursing homes. And all of these stories deserve to be told, because in each one of them, there is a love that resists loss, illness, and oblivion. I've learned that true love needs no recognition or reward. True love simply is. It is given without measure. It is given without guarantee. And the most powerful thing of all is that it remains. Even if the mind shuts down, even if the body deteriorates, even if names are erased, love remains. And that is the greatest victory against Alzheimer's. Today, I find myself a new version of myself, a version that has cried, cared, sustained those who have fallen, and yet has kept walking. A more human, more conscious, more alive version. Because accompanying my father through that process didn't take away my life. It multiplied it. He made me see the beauty in simplicity. He taught me that time isn't measured in years, but in moments shared. in knowing glances, in meaningful silences. And if you, who are watching this video, are also caring for someone with Alzheimer's, I want to tell you something from the bottom of my heart. You are not alone. You are not alone. What you do every day is immense. Even if no one applauds, even if sometimes you feel like you can't go on, even if the fatigue weighs on every bone, you are doing the most important thing you can do for another human being. You are loving. You are holding. You are being a beacon in the midst of darkness. And that is heroic. If you lost someone like me, I embrace you in your pain. Allow yourself to feel. Allow yourself to grieve. Allow yourself to heal in your own time. And remember that that person lives on in you, in your memories, in your words, in your way of loving, in your way of seeing the world. No one dies completely as long as there is someone who remembers them with love. And if you haven't yet experienced something like this but are here listening to this story, I thank you too, because by doing so, you are opening your heart to a reality that deserves to be seen with understanding and support. You are allowing the pain of others to transform you, and that is profoundly human. Today I speak out for my father and for all those who can no longer tell their story. May this video serve as a tribute to them, to their lives, to their struggle, to their dignity. May we never forget that behind every diagnosis lies a unique story, a loved one, a lifetime of moments that deserve to be honored. And if this story touched your soul, if you felt supported, understood, or simply moved, I invite you to stay with us on this channel. Here we share true stories filled with emotion, truth, and hope. Stories that heal, embrace, and accompany. Your subscription is more than a number. It's a way of saying yes, these stories matter. Yes, these people deserve to be remembered. Yes, love lives on. And if you can, leave us a word, a thought, a name in the comments. Tell us who that person is who lives in your heart. Whom have you not forgotten? Whom would you like to honor today? Your voice matters. Your story matters. Copy and paste this phrase if you feel it's yours. My love goes beyond forgetting. Reading them gives us strength and can give strength to someone else who needs to feel supported right now. Thank you for being here. Thank you for allowing my father to continue living through these words. See you in the next video, which is already playing. May your heart always find comfort. May your memory be filled with love. And may we never stop telling these stories that deserve to last forever. See you soon.